Long before her name became synonymous with the changing of seasons, long before poets would craft songs around her dual nature as both spring's bright maiden and winter's solemn queen, long before mothers would tell their daughters her story as both a warning and a comfort, there was a young goddess who knew nothing of darkness, nothing of grief, nothing of the strange and powerful transformations that awaited her in a future she could not yet imagine. Her name was Persephone, and her story begins in a world filled with sunlight. She was born to two of the most powerful beings in the entire Greek pantheon. Her father was Zeus himself, king of the gods, ruler of the sky, the most powerful deity in all of existence. Her mother was Demeter, goddess of the harvest, of the grain, of all things that grew from the soil and sustained mortal life. From these two divine parents, Persephone inherited a unique combination of attributes that would make her unlike any other goddess in the pantheon. From Zeus, she received the spark of divine royalty, the regal bearing that marked her as belonging to the highest order of immortals. From Demeter, she received an intimate connection to the natural world, to growing things, to the cycles of life and renewal that governed the seasons. She was, from the moment of her birth, both princess of Olympus and daughter of the earth itself. But unlike most children of powerful Olympian gods, Persephone was not raised on Mount Olympus in the company of the other deities. Demeter, fiercely protective of her only daughter, possessive in ways that bordered on obsessive, kept Persephone away from the constant political maneuvering and complicated relationships that defined life among the Olympian gods. Demeter had seen how the gods treated their own children, how Zeus's affairs created jealous rivalries, how divine feasts often descended into bitter arguments, how the politics of Olympus could shape and warp even the purest of souls. She wanted none of that for her precious Persephone. So Demeter raised her daughter in the fields and meadows of the mortal world, in the green spaces where flowers bloomed and grain grew tall in the summer sun. They moved through the seasons together, mother and daughter, with Demeter teaching Persephone the names of every flower, the properties of every plant, the rhythm of growth and harvest that governed all life on earth. Persephone learned to recognize the difference between herbs that healed and herbs that harmed. She learned to coax bashful flowers into bloom with the gentle touch of her divine fingers. She learned that wheat needed sunlight and rain in specific proportions, that olive trees required patience to bear fruit, that the smallest seed contained within itself the potential for an enormous tree. These were not lessons taught in dusty classrooms, but lessons absorbed through years of constant practice, through walking barefoot through fields, through kneeling in the dirt to examine roots and leaves, through breathing the scented air of countless meadows in countless dawns. She grew into a young goddess of extraordinary beauty, though her beauty was nothing like the polished, formal radiance of the Olympian goddesses who lived above the clouds. Her beauty was earthier, more immediate, more alive. Her cheeks held the flush of someone who spent her days in open air. Her hair, the color of golden wheat at harvest time, often carried fragments of leaves or petals that had brushed against her during her wanderings. Her eyes held the green of spring meadows after rain. She was beautiful in the way that the natural world itself is beautiful, not posed or constructed for admiration, but vital and present and undeniably alive. And she was beloved, not just by her mother, who watched over her with the fierce devotion of a goddess who had channeled all her capacity for love into a single being, but by all the lesser deities who shared the wild spaces with her. The nymphs who lived in streams and rivers welcomed her presence. The dryads who inhabited trees would emerge from their bark to greet her as she passed. Even the small wild creatures of the forests, deer, rabbits, foxes, seemed to recognize that Persephone meant them no harm, would approach her with a trust they showed to no other being. She was, in every way, a creature of light and life and growth. But Persephone was also lonely in a way she did not fully understand, because while she was surrounded by nature spirits and woodland creatures, while she had her mother's complete and absolute devotion, she had no equals. The nymphs were lesser beings, charming but not capable of true companionship. The mortal humans who occasionally encountered her treated her with reverent fear, as one would treat any divine being who appeared in their fields. And her mother, for all her love, was always her mother. Protective, attentive, but ultimately representing authority rather than friendship. Persephone began to wonder, as she entered young goddesshood, what existed beyond the meadows and fields her mother kept her in. She had heard stories, fragmentary tales overheard from passing travelers, whispered conversations between nymphs, occasional comments from Demeter herself about other gods and other realms. She knew Olympus existed, knew of the magnificent halls where the major deities feasted and made their decisions. She knew the sea existed, with Poseidon ruling its depths. She knew even that there was an underworld, a realm of the dead, ruled by her uncle Hades, though Demeter spoke of this realm rarely and never approvingly. What would it be like, Persephone sometimes wondered, to see these other places, to meet other gods, to experience the world beyond the careful, beautiful, but ultimately limited space her mother had created for her? These were thoughts she kept to herself. She knew, even without being told, that Demeter would not approve of such questions. Demeter wanted her daughter safe, and safety meant remaining in familiar fields under maternal protection. Adventure, exploration, contact with other gods. These things meant risk, meant the possibility of harm, meant the chance that Persephone might be hurt or stolen or changed in ways Demeter could not control. So Persephone kept her wonderings private, expressed them only in quiet moments to herself, to the indifferent flowers, to the rivers that carried her secrets away to the sea. But the universe, as it so often does, was preparing changes that no mother's protection could prevent. In the deep underworld, in the kingdom of the dead, in the silent halls where souls drifted in eternal twilight, the god Hades was experiencing his own form of loneliness. He had ruled his realm for ages, had ordered it according to principles of justice and balance, had created a kingdom worthy of his divine station. But he ruled alone. While his brothers Zeus and Poseidon had wives and consorts and households filled with divine company, Hades existed in solitary contemplation, surrounded only by the dead and the spirits who served him. It was Zeus himself who first suggested the match. The king of the gods, perhaps moved by genuine concern for his brother, perhaps simply engaging in the kind of political maneuvering that defined his rule, looked down from Olympus and recognized that his daughter Persephone and his brother Hades might suit each other in ways neither would expect. Persephone needed something more than her mother's overprotective custody. She needed a kingdom of her own, a sphere of influence that would allow her to grow into the full power of her divine nature. And Hades needed a queen, someone who could complement his solemn authority with something warmer, someone whose presence could soften the cold edges of his realm without diminishing its essential nature. Zeus made his decision without consulting Demeter or Persephone herself. This was, in his view, a matter of divine politics that did not require their input. He sanctioned the union, gave Hades permission to take Persephone as his bride, and considered the matter settled. But Zeus also understood that Demeter would never voluntarily release her daughter, and so the marriage would have to occur through means other than formal negotiation. It was on an ordinary day, beneath an unremarkable sky, that Persephone's old life ended and her new life began. She had been wandering with a group of nymph companions in a meadow filled with flowers of extraordinary variety. There were roses and violets and crocuses, lilies and hyacinths and irises. Every flower seemed to be blooming at once, as if the meadow itself wanted to display its maximum beauty for the young goddess who walked through it. And in the center of the meadow, Persephone noticed a flower unlike any she had ever seen before. It was a narcissus, but a narcissus of impossible perfection. Its petals were larger than any normal narcissus, its scent more intoxicating, its golden center seeming to glow with inner light. The flower was so striking, so unusual, so clearly special, that Persephone could not resist approaching it. She bent down to examine the magnificent flower. She reached out her hand to touch its petals, perhaps to pick it and add it to the garland she had been weaving with her nymph companions. And in that instant, the earth beneath her feet split open. It was not a gradual opening, not a slow widening of the ground. It was a sudden, violent rupture, as if the very fabric of the world had been torn apart. From the dark chasm that appeared beneath the flower, a chariot emerged, a chariot of obsidian and gold, pulled by 4 enormous horses as black as the deepest night, their eyes glowing with red fire, their breath misting in the air despite the warm summer day. And in the chariot stood Hades himself. He was tall and imposing, his form radiating the kind of authority that made nymphs flee in terror, that made even brave mortals fall to their knees. His skin was pale, almost luminescent, like marble that had never known sunlight. His hair and beard were dark as ravens' wings. His eyes held depths that contained centuries of solemn contemplation, the weight of judging countless souls, the burden of ruling the kingdom from which no living being normally returned. He looked at Persephone with an expression that was neither cruel nor cold, but it was undeniably possessive, decisive, final. Persephone's nymph companions screamed and scattered, running in all directions to escape the terrifying apparition. But Persephone herself stood frozen, too shocked to move, too overwhelmed by the impossible reality of what was happening to even cry out. Hades reached down from his chariot, his powerful arm extending toward her, his hand closing around her waist with the gentle but unbreakable grip of someone who would not be denied. He lifted her into the chariot beside him as if she weighed nothing, as if her resistance, whatever resistance she might have offered, was simply irrelevant. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying within it both warning and reassurance. "You are to be my queen." Persephone finally found her voice. She screamed, a sound of terror and confusion and outrage, a sound that carried across the meadow and rippled through the air toward the distant ears of her mother. She called for Demeter, called for help, called for someone to save her from this impossible nightmare that was unfolding around her. But Hades had already turned his horses. The chariot was already plunging back toward the chasm in the earth, descending into darkness, carrying Persephone away from the world of light and growing things and her mother's protective love. The earth closed behind them as they descended. The narcissus that had drawn her into the trap, the flower whose impossible beauty had been crafted specifically by Gaia at Zeus's request to lure Persephone into this exact moment, withered and disappeared. The meadow returned to its ordinary appearance, with only the scattered footprints of fleeing nymphs and the broken remnants of Persephone's flower garland, providing any evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Persephone was gone, and the world above, though it did not yet know it, was about to enter a season of grief that would reshape the very nature of existence itself. The journey through the earth was unlike anything Persephone could have imagined. The chariot plunged downward through layers of stone and darkness, passing through caverns that glowed with strange mineral lights, descending past underground rivers whose waters carried whispers in languages no living being should understand. Hades drove the horses with the calm confidence of someone who had traveled this path countless times, while Persephone clung to the chariot's edge, her mind unable to process the rapid succession of impossible sights. The air grew colder as they descended, though it was not the cold of winter. It was something else, something more fundamental, a coldness that seemed to come from the absence of life itself rather than from any natural source. Persephone shivered, not just from the temperature, but from the deep, instinctive understanding that she was being carried into a realm that no living being was meant to enter. When the chariot finally emerged from the tunnels into the open space of the underworld proper, Persephone gasped despite herself. The realm was vast, vastly larger than she could have imagined, stretching in all directions farther than her eyes could see. Caverns the size of mountains, rivers that wound through landscapes of strange beauty, forests of pale, leafless trees that grew toward no sun, because no sun existed in this place. And everywhere, drifting through the spaces between landmarks, the souls of the dead, countless souls, more souls than there were stars in the sky above, each one a flickering presence of pale light moving through the eternal twilight of Hades' kingdom. It was terrible. It was magnificent. It was unlike anything Persephone had ever seen or even imagined could exist. Hades guided his chariot through the spaces of his realm with the casual ease of a king moving through his own palace. The souls of the dead made way for him as he passed, bowing their pale forms in acknowledgement of their ruler. The dark guardians of the various regions, the Furies, the Judges, the spirits who maintained the order of the Underworld, nodded their respect. And finally, the chariot reached the palace of Hades, a structure built from black stone and obsidian, decorated with metals that did not exist in the upper world, designed with an architectural style that seemed both ancient and timeless. The palace rose from the underworld floor like a mountain made by intelligent hands, vast and imposing, and unmistakably the seat of a powerful ruler. Inside the palace, servants emerged, pale spirits who had been chosen for the duty of serving the lord of the underworld. They bowed before Hades and the captured goddess he brought with him. They prepared chambers for her, arranged for clothing and comforts, attempted in their pale way to welcome her to her new home. But Persephone could only stare in shock and growing terror at the reality of her situation. She had been abducted. She had been carried away from the world of light and growing things. She had been brought to the realm of the dead, to a palace that, for all its dark magnificence, was nothing like the Meadows where she had spent her entire life. And the god who had taken her, the god who now claimed her as his bride, his queen, his consort, stood watching her with an expression she could not fully interpret. Was it desire? Hades wanted her. She could see that. But it was not the rapacious lust she might have expected from such a powerful god seizing a young goddess. It was something more measured, more contemplative, more genuinely interested in her as a person, rather than simply as an object to be possessed. Was it kindness? There was something in the way he ordered the servants to make her comfortable, in the way he carefully avoided overwhelming her with his presence, in the way he seemed to be giving her space to process her dramatic new circumstances. He was not what she had expected from the legends about the dread lord of the underworld. Was it loneliness? Now that she looked more carefully at him, now that the initial shock of the abduction was beginning to fade, she could see the deep, ancient loneliness in his eyes. Here was a god who had ruled his realm for ages, surrounded constantly by the dead, but never having a true companion. Here was a being who had perhaps reached out and taken her not out of cruelty, but out of a hunger for connection that he did not know how else to satisfy. These observations did not erase her fear. They did not justify what had been done to her, but they complicated her understanding of the God who stood before her, and they planted the first seeds of something other than pure terror in her response to her situation. "You will be my queen," Hades told her again, his voice deep and measured. "You will rule this realm beside me. You will have power and respect beyond anything you have known. The dead will bow to you. The dark guardians will serve you. You will be more than a maiden in a meadow. You will be a goddess in the fullest sense of what that word means." He paused, then added something that surprised her even more. "But I will not force you. I have taken you. Yes, there was no other way, given your mother's protectiveness. But what happens next is your choice. You can remain miserable here, can spend your days mourning what you have lost, or you can begin to understand what you have gained. The choice is yours." And with that, he left her in the chambers his servants had prepared, allowing her the space to begin processing everything that had happened. Persephone, alone for the first time since her abduction, finally allowed herself to weep. She wept for her mother, who must be searching frantically for her in the world above. She wept for her old life of simple meadows and familiar fields. She wept for the loss of innocence that this experience represented, for the fundamental violation of having been taken without her consent, for the impossible situation she now found herself in. But even as she wept, even as grief and rage flowed through her, she found herself unable to maintain pure hatred for the god who had taken her. There was something about Hades, something genuine, something melancholy, something that suggested he was not the monster he might have appeared to be, that made it impossible for her to dismiss him as simply evil. The days passed. Persephone explored her new realm, accompanied by the pale spirits who served her. She walked through gardens that grew in eternal twilight, where flowers bloomed in shades she had never seen in the upper world. Silvers and blacks, and deep purples that had no equivalent under the sun. She visited the rivers that flowed through the underworld, each one carrying its own particular significance. The Acheron of sorrow, the Cocytus of lamentation, the Phlegethon of fire, the Lethe of forgetfulness, and most importantly, the sacred Styx. She met the dark guardians of the realm, the three judges who decided the fates of incoming souls, the Furies who pursued those who had escaped justice in life, even the three-headed dog Cerberus who guarded the entrance to the underworld. None of them treated her with the fear or revulsion she might have expected. Instead, they greeted her with respect, with acknowledgement that she was the new queen of their realm, with a kind of welcome that suggested they had been waiting for her arrival. And Hades himself, true to his word, did not force anything upon her. He gave her space and time. He answered her questions when she asked them. He showed her around his realm with the patient pride of a king displaying his kingdom to someone whose opinion mattered to him. Slowly, against her own will, against her own grief and anger, Persephone began to see things in the underworld that genuinely interested her. She saw that Hades ruled with a justice that was harsher than any in the upper world, but also more absolutely fair. There was no corruption in the underworld, no playing favorites, no avoiding consequences. Every soul faced honest judgment for the life they had lived. The good were rewarded, the wicked were punished, and those who had been neither particularly good nor particularly wicked drifted in the great middle realms, neither suffering nor blessed, simply existing in eternal contemplation. She saw that the souls of the dead, while they could no longer experience the joys of the living world, had their own forms of peace. They were free from the anxieties and ambitions that had driven them in life. They were free from physical pain and the fear of death. They existed in a state that was not unlike a kind of meditation, processing and reflecting on the lives they had lived. She began to understand that Hades' realm was not the place of horror that her mother had implied. It was solemn, yes, it was somber, but it served a vital function in the cosmic order. Without death, without an underworld to receive the dead, the upper world would become overrun with souls who had nowhere to go. The cycle of life required the cycle of death. The growth of new life required the rest of old life. And Hades, for all his solemn authority, was not cruel. He was the necessary opposite of the bright energy of the upper world, the dark counterpart that allowed the light to have meaning. As Persephone made these observations, as she explored her new realm with growing understanding rather than pure dread, Hades watched her carefully. He never pressed his suit. He never demanded that she love him or even accept him. He simply gave her space, gave her information, gave her the opportunity to come to her own conclusions about her new circumstances. It was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her, in a strange way. Her mother had loved her fiercely, but had also controlled her absolutely. The other gods had largely ignored her, treating her as Demeter's daughter rather than as a being in her own right. Hades, for all that he had taken her against her will, was the first being who treated her as someone capable of making her own choices, of forming her own opinions, of being a goddess in her own right, rather than simply a daughter or a possession. This realization did not erase her anger at having been abducted, but it complicated her feelings in ways she had not anticipated. Meanwhile, in the world above, Demeter was destroying everything. The moment Persephone had been taken, the moment that scream had echoed across the meadow and been carried by the wind to the distant ears of the goddess of harvest, Demeter had known something terrible had happened. She had felt the absence of her daughter immediately, had sensed the disturbance in the natural order, had recognized that the connection between herself and Persephone had been severed in some impossible way. She had searched first in the obvious places, the meadows where they had walked together, the fields where Persephone had played, the forests and rivers and gardens of all the lands she knew. She had asked every nymph, every dryad, every minor deity she encountered if they had seen her daughter, if they knew where she had gone, if they had any information that might help in the search. But Persephone had not simply wandered off. She had been taken to a realm that existed beneath the world Demeter knew, hidden from the goddess of growing things by the very fact of its nature. No nymph could tell Demeter what had happened. No dryad had witnessed the abduction. The only beings who had seen anything were the nymph companions who had been with Persephone in the meadow, and they had been so terrified that their accounts were fragmentary and contradictory. Demeter searched for 9 days and 9 nights without rest. She travelled across all the lands of the mortal world, holding torches lit from the volcanic fires of Mount Etna, so she could continue searching through the darkness. She did not eat. She did not sleep. She did not bathe. She gave herself entirely to the desperate search for her stolen daughter. And as she searched, as her grief and rage grew with each day that passed without finding Persephone, the world around her began to change. The grain stopped growing. Demeter, in her absolute devotion to finding her daughter, had withdrawn her attention from the harvest. She had stopped tending the crops, stopped blessing the fields, stopped maintaining the careful balance that ensured the growth of food for mortal beings. And the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Plants that had been thriving began to wither. Wheat fields turned brown and died. Fruit trees ceased to bear fruit. Vegetables refused to grow. The very soil seemed to lose its capacity to nurture life, becoming hard and dry and barren. The mortals who depended on the harvest for their survival began to suffer. They prayed desperately for relief, made offerings at every temple they could find, begged the gods to restore the natural order that allowed them to live. But Demeter was beyond hearing their prayers. She was beyond caring about the mortal world. Her entire being was consumed by the search for her daughter, and nothing else mattered. It was Helios, the sun god, who finally brought Demeter the information she needed. Helios saw everything that happened during the daylight hours, his chariot crossing the sky and illuminating all the lands beneath him. He had witnessed Persephone's abduction. He had seen Hades' chariot emerging from the earth, had watched the goddess being seized, had observed the entire incident from his elevated position. When Demeter, exhausted and on the brink of total despair, finally encountered Helios and demanded to know if he had seen her daughter, the sun god told her the truth. He explained what had happened, who had taken Persephone, and where she had been carried. "Your daughter has been taken to the underworld," Helios told her gently. "She is now in the realm of Hades, and from what I have seen, she is to be his queen. Zeus himself sanctioned the union. There was no random act of cruelty here. This was a planned and approved abduction." Demeter's reaction to this information was not relief. It was not understanding. It was not acceptance. It was rage of such magnitude that the very air around her seemed to crackle with divine fury. Her daughter had been stolen. Her own brother Hades had been the thief. And her own brother Zeus, the father of Persephone, the king of the gods, the deity who should have been her ally in protecting their daughter, had sanctioned the abduction. He had not consulted her. He had not asked her permission. He had simply allowed his brother to take their daughter as if Persephone were a commodity to be traded between powerful men. Demeter withdrew from the world entirely. She did not return to Olympus. She did not seek out other gods for assistance. She did not engage in the kind of political maneuvering that might have led to Persephone's return through diplomatic means. Instead, she went into hiding, disguised herself as an old mortal woman, and travelled through the mortal world in a state of mourning so absolute that she refused to bless any crops, refused to allow anything to grow, refused to perform any of the divine functions that sustained mortal life. If the gods would not return her daughter, she would let everything die. The famine that followed was unprecedented. Crops failed across every land. Famine swept through every nation. Mortals died by the thousands, then by the tens of thousands, then by numbers too great to count. Civilizations that had depended on agriculture for their existence began to collapse. Cities emptied as people fled in search of food that did not exist anywhere. Whole populations were wiped out as the natural order itself ground to a complete halt. And the gods, even those on Olympus who had not been directly involved in the abduction, began to suffer in their own way. The gods depended on sacrifices from mortals, the burning of meat, the pouring of wine, the offerings of grain at temples, to maintain their honor and their connection to the world below. When mortals had nothing to sacrifice, when entire populations were starving to death, the gods themselves began to feel the absence of the worship that was rightfully theirs. Zeus, watching the catastrophe unfold from his throne on Olympus, finally understood that the situation could not continue. The mortal world was being destroyed. The natural order was collapsing. Something had to be done. He sent messengers to Demeter, asking her to relent, to allow the crops to grow again, to restore the natural order. But Demeter's response was unwavering and absolute. She would not allow anything to grow until her daughter was returned to her. She did not care about the mortals dying. She did not care about the disrupted natural order. She did not care about the suffering of the gods or the collapse of civilizations. Her daughter had been taken from her, and until her daughter was returned, the world could burn for all she cared. Zeus, facing the very real possibility that his beloved mortal worshippers might be entirely eliminated from existence, that his own divine power might be diminished by the absence of worship, finally realized he had no choice. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, the diplomat, the deity skilled at navigating impossible situations, to the underworld with a message for Hades. Persephone must be returned to the world above. The decision had been made. The cost of keeping her in the underworld had grown too great. Even Zeus, who had originally sanctioned the abduction, now understood that the price of his decision had been miscalculated. But Hades, when Hermes arrived with this message, was not entirely willing to comply. He had grown to genuinely care for Persephone during her time in his realm. He had hoped, perhaps, that her growing acceptance of the underworld might eventually grow into something deeper, into real affection, even into love. He was not eager to lose her so easily. And then he remembered something. Among the gifts and food he had offered Persephone during her time in the underworld, he had given her a pomegranate, that strange, ancient fruit whose seeds glowed like jewels, whose flesh tasted of both sweetness and bitterness, whose nature was deeply tied to the underworld itself. Persephone had eaten some of the seeds, not many, only 6 in fact, in a moment when hunger had finally overcome her resistance to accepting anything from her captor's hand. But she had eaten them. And there was an ancient rule, older than the gods themselves, woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. Anyone who consumed food from the underworld was bound to the underworld. Hades smiled, though the expression held more melancholy than triumph. He understood now that Persephone could not entirely return to the world above. The seeds had bound her to him, to his realm, in ways that could not be undone. Whatever compromise might be reached, Persephone would never again be entirely free of the underworld. And so the negotiations began. Negotiations that would determine not just Persephone's fate, but the fate of the seasons themselves, the rhythm of life and death on Earth, the fundamental balance between the world above and the world below. Hermes arrived in the underworld with the formal authority of Zeus himself, his caduceus staff held before him as a symbol of his divine office, his winged sandals carrying him swiftly through the dark caverns and pale rivers of Hades' kingdom. He found Persephone in the palace gardens, walking among the silver flowers that bloomed only in eternal twilight, accompanied by the pale spirits who served as her attendants. She had changed during her time in the underworld, though the changes were subtle, visible only to those who looked carefully. She still possessed the beauty that had marked her since birth, still carried herself with the natural grace of someone raised in meadows and fields. But there was something new in her bearing now, a depth of understanding, a quiet authority, a kind of solemnity that had not existed in the carefree maiden who had been abducted from the upper world. She had begun, without quite realizing it, to become a queen. Hermes greeted her with the respect due to her new station, then explained the situation that had developed in the world above. He told her about her mother's grief, about the famine destroying the mortal world, about the demands that had been made for her return. He explained that Zeus had decreed her release, that she was free to return to the upper world, that she could leave the underworld immediately if she chose. Persephone listened carefully, processing this information with the same measured consideration that had become characteristic of her since her arrival in this realm. She felt the expected emotions: relief that her mother would be comforted, joy at the possibility of seeing sunlight again, gratitude that the catastrophe in the mortal world could be ended. But she felt other things too, things she had not anticipated and could not quite explain even to herself. She felt reluctance at the thought of leaving the underworld entirely. She felt sadness at the prospect of saying goodbye to Hades, who had become, against all expectations and against her initial resistance, something more than her abductor. She felt the strange and unsettling realization that the realm of the dead had become, in some real sense, her home. This was not what she had expected. This was not what anyone would have expected. Yet it was the truth of her experience, and Persephone had been raised by Demeter to be honest with herself about her own feelings. Hades joined the conversation, his presence solemn as always, but carrying an undertone of something that might have been hope. He explained what Hermes had not yet revealed: the matter of the pomegranate seeds, the ancient law that bound anyone who consumed underworld food to the underworld itself. Persephone's eyes widened as she understood the implications. She had eaten the seeds. She remembered the moment. Hades had offered her the pomegranate days ago, when she had finally allowed her hunger to overcome her resistance, when she had taken just 6 small seeds from the fruit and consumed them. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, an insignificant gesture of finally accepting some nourishment from her captor's hand. But it had not been insignificant at all. Those 6 seeds had bound her to the underworld in ways she could never undo. Hermes, faced with this complication, returned to the upper world to consult with Zeus. The king of the gods, when he heard about the pomegranate seeds, recognized immediately that this required a compromise. Persephone could not be entirely returned to her mother, because the laws of the cosmos themselves had been engaged by her consumption of underworld food. But neither could she remain entirely in the underworld, because Demeter would never stop her destructive grief if her daughter was not returned to her. The solution that Zeus crafted, after consultations with all the relevant parties, would reshape the entire natural world for all eternity. Persephone would spend part of each year in the underworld, ruling beside Hades as his queen. For each pomegranate seed she had eaten, 6 in total, she would spend 1 month of each year in Hades' realm. During this time, she would be the queen of the dead, sharing in Hades' authority over the underworld, ruling with him over the souls and spirits of his kingdom. The remaining 6 months, she would return to the upper world to be with her mother. During this time, she would resume her role as the maiden goddess of spring and growth, would walk again in meadows and fields, would be reunited with Demeter and the world she had originally known. When Demeter learned of this compromise, she initially refused to accept it. She demanded her daughter back completely, refused to acknowledge any binding force that could keep Persephone from her for any portion of the year. But Zeus made clear that no other arrangement was possible. The pomegranate seeds had been eaten. The ancient laws had been invoked. Persephone could not be entirely separated from the underworld, no matter how much her mother wished it. And so Demeter, with great reluctance, but ultimately with no real choice, agreed to the compromise. But she added her own dimension to the arrangement. During the 6 months that Persephone was in the underworld, Demeter would withdraw her blessing from the natural world. She would mourn her daughter's absence, and her mourning would manifest as winter, as the dying of crops, the falling of leaves, the cold and barrenness of a world from which the goddess of growth had withdrawn her favor. When Persephone returned to her each spring, Demeter's joy would return with her, and with that joy, the world would bloom again. Plants would grow, crops would flourish. The natural world would celebrate the reunion of mother and daughter with abundance and beauty. And so the seasons were born. Spring came when Persephone returned from the underworld. The flowers bloomed in celebration of her return. The trees produced new leaves. The animals emerged from winter hiding. Mortals planted their crops in anticipation of the harvest to come. Everything that had been dormant during the cold months awakened with renewed vigor, sensing somehow that the goddess of growth had returned to her mother's side. Summer was the height of Persephone's time in the upper world. During these months, she was at her most fully maiden form, playing in meadows, walking through fields, helping her mother bless the crops and ensure abundant harvests. The world flourished under the combined attention of mother and daughter, and mortals enjoyed the bounty that this attention created. Autumn began the slow preparation for Persephone's return to the underworld. The leaves began to change colours, taking on the gold and red and orange hues that mirrored the dying of the year. Crops were harvested in a final rush before the cold months came. The world began to prepare itself for the absence of the goddess of growth, gathering what could be gathered, preserving what could be preserved. And then winter arrived, the season when Persephone descended into the underworld to resume her role as queen. Demeter's grief manifested as the cold, the snow, the barrenness of the natural world. Nothing grew, nothing bloomed. Mortals huddled in their homes and waited for the return of warmer days, surviving on what they had preserved during the abundance of the previous seasons. This cycle would continue for all eternity, the seasons turning in their endless rhythm, each one marked by the movement of Persephone between her two worlds. But the deeper transformation that came from this arrangement was not in the natural world. It was in Persephone herself, because during her months in the underworld, Persephone became something her mother could never fully understand or accept. A queen in her own right, with her own authority, her own kingdom, her own sphere of influence that existed independently of Demeter. She ruled beside Hades with growing confidence and skill. She took on responsibilities for judging certain types of souls, for mediating disputes among the Dark Guardians, for making decisions about the operation of the underworld that complemented Hades' own decisions. She was not merely Hades' wife, she was his equal, his partner, his queen in the truest sense of the word. The souls of the dead came to know her and respect her. They saw in her something that softened the harshness of their existence. A queen who understood the world they had lost, who could sympathize with their longing for the lives they had lived, who brought a kind of gentle understanding to the otherwise austere realm of the dead. The dark guardians of the underworld, who had served Hades alone for ages, learned to serve Persephone as well. The Furies, terrible spirits of vengeance, treated her with deep respect. The judges of the dead consulted with her on difficult cases. Even Cerberus, the three-headed guardian dog, recognized her authority and obeyed her commands. And Hades himself, who had originally abducted her, who had taken her against her will, who had been her captor before becoming her husband, treated her with a love and respect that he showed to no other being. He had genuinely come to cherish her, not as a possession, but as a person whose company he valued, whose opinion he sought, whose presence transformed his solitary existence into something meaningful. What had begun as an abduction had become, over the centuries, one of the most enduring marriages in the entire Greek pantheon. It was not the romantic love story that mortal songs would later try to make it into. It was something stranger and more complex, a union born from violation that had transformed into genuine partnership, a relationship that contained within it both the original injustice and the unexpected love that had grown despite that injustice. Persephone never forgot how she had come to the underworld. She never pretended that her abduction had been acceptable, or that Hades had been right to take her. But she had also grown into her role as queen, had developed genuine affection for her husband, had found in her dark realm a kind of fulfillment that her sheltered life in the upper world had never provided. She was, in a way that no other goddess could quite match, a being of duality, simultaneously the maiden of spring and the queen of death, simultaneously her mother's beloved daughter and her husband's equal partner, simultaneously the symbol of growth and the symbol of endings. This duality made her unique among the gods. She understood things that no other deity could understand, the necessary balance between light and dark, between life and death, between innocence and experience. She had been forced to become someone different from what she had originally been, and in becoming that someone, She had gained wisdom that no carefree maiden could ever possess. The mortals who worshipped her recognized this duality. They built temples to her that honored both aspects of her nature. Temples in bright fields that celebrated her as the goddess of spring, and temples in dark caves that honored her as the queen of the underworld. They invoked her name in prayers about birth and death, about beginnings and endings, about the great cycles that governed all existence. She became, perhaps more than any other goddess, a deity who spoke to the full range of human experience. She understood loss because she had been lost. She understood transformation because she had been transformed. She understood the difficult truth that growth often comes through grief, that wisdom often emerges from suffering, that the deepest forms of meaning often arise from experiences we would not have chosen for ourselves. In the centuries after the establishment of the seasonal cycle, Persephone's worship spread throughout the Greek world and beyond. Mystery religions formed around her story, secret cults whose initiates believed that by participating in rituals related to her descent and return, they could share in some measure of her dual wisdom, could prepare themselves for their own eventual deaths by understanding the journey that Persephone had taken between worlds. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the most famous of these mystery religions, were dedicated specifically to Demeter and Persephone, and their rituals reenacted the abduction, the search, and the return. Those who were initiated into these mysteries believed they had received special knowledge about death and the afterlife, knowledge that would help them navigate their own eventual journey to the underworld with greater wisdom and less fear. Persephone, who had begun her existence as an innocent maiden in meadows of flowers, had become one of the most theologically important goddesses in the entire Greek pantheon. Her story was not merely entertaining mythology, it was a foundational narrative about the nature of existence itself, about the necessary balance between opposites, about the way transformation works in the deepest sense. And the cycle continued. Spring after spring, Persephone returned to her mother and the upper world. Winter after winter, she descended again to her husband and her dark kingdom. The mortals above watched these cycles, depended on them, organized their entire lives around the seasonal rhythms that her movements created. She had been taken against her will, and from that taking, an entire cosmic order had emerged. The injustice of her abduction had been transformed, through her own growth and choices, into something larger than itself, a system that provided structure for the natural world, meaning for mortal existence, and continuity for the eternal cycles that governed all life. And so we come to the end of Persephone's story, though in truth, her story has no ending, because the cycles she created are still turning, the seasons she embodied still cycling through the years, the duality she represented still informing every transition between light and dark, growth and decay, beginning and ending. Persephone began as an innocent maiden raised in meadows by an overprotective mother, sheltered from the harsh realities of the divine world, kept safe from anything that might disturb her carefree existence. She knew nothing of darkness, nothing of grief, nothing of the complex realities that defined the lives of beings who had experienced real loss or genuine challenge. She was abducted in a moment of impossible violation, carried away to a realm she had never imagined existed, forced into a marriage she had not chosen with a god she had never met. The injustice of her abduction was real and absolute. There is no way to read her story as anything other than a violation of her autonomy, an exercise of male power over a young goddess who had no say in her own fate. But Persephone did something remarkable with the impossible situation she had been thrust into. She did not simply accept her fate as a victim. She did not allow herself to be defined by the violence that had been done to her. Instead, she grew. She learned. She transformed. She took the situation she had been forced into and shaped it into something she could call her own. She came to understand the realm she had been abducted into, to appreciate its dark beauty and necessary function. She came to know the God who had taken her, recognizing in him not the monster she had initially feared, but a complex being who had acted out of his own loneliness and longing. She came to accept her role as queen, finding in that role a power and authority she had never possessed in her sheltered life with her mother. And through the cycle of her movement between worlds, She became something neither her mother nor her husband had originally imagined, a goddess of duality, a being who belonged fully to both the realm of light and the realm of darkness, a deity whose existence bridged the great opposites that defined existence itself. Her story teaches us that transformation often comes through experiences we would never have chosen for ourselves. It reminds us that growth frequently emerges from grief, that wisdom often arises from suffering, that the deepest forms of meaning are usually born from situations that initially seemed only to be tragedies. Persephone did not choose her abduction, but she chose what to do with the circumstances she found herself in. And that choice, to grow rather than remain frozen in her victimization, became the foundation of who she ultimately became. Her story also reminds us that we are not required to choose between the different aspects of our nature. Persephone did not have to choose between being her mother's daughter and being her husband's queen. She did not have to choose between the world of growth and the world of endings. She found a way to be both, to honor both, to embody both, and in that embodiment, she became more than she could have been if she had remained simply one thing. The seasons themselves are her legacy. Every spring that arrives, every winter that descends, every cycle of growth and dormancy that the natural world experiences. These are echoes of her own movements between worlds, reminders of her story playing out in the rhythms of the earth itself. To experience the seasons is to participate in Persephone's eternal cycle, to feel in our own bones the same patterns that govern her divine existence. She was maiden and queen, daughter and wife, goddess of spring and goddess of death, innocent and experienced, free and bound, lost and found. She held all these contradictions within herself and refused to resolve them, refused to simplify them, refused to become any one thing when she could be all of them. And in that refusal to be simplified, in that insistence on holding her full complexity, Persephone teaches us perhaps the most important lesson of all, that we do not have to be only one thing. We do not have to fit into the categories others try to assign to us. We do not have to choose between the different parts of ourselves. We can be complex, contradictory, dual, or multiple, and in that complexity, we can find a kind of wholeness that purity could never provide. Persephone descended into darkness and returned changed. She experienced violation and transformed it into purpose. She lost her innocence and gained wisdom. She was forced into a kingdom she did not choose and made it her own. She bridged worlds that no one else could bridge, and in doing so, she became one of the most powerful and important goddesses in the entire pantheon. Her story endures because it speaks to something universal in the human experience. The way we are all forced, at various points in our lives, to descend into our own underworlds, to face our own darknesses, to encounter aspects of ourselves and our world that we would never have chosen to encounter. And like Persephone, we are faced with the choice of how to respond to these descents. We can remain victims, frozen in the moment of our violation, or we can grow, transform, become more than we were before, find our own crowns in the unexpected kingdoms we find ourselves ruling. Persephone chose to grow. She chose to transform. She chose to become a queen rather than remain a stolen maiden. And in that choice, she became eternal, not just in the literal sense of her divine immortality, but in the deeper sense that her story would be told and retold for thousands of years, would resonate with countless generations of humans facing their own descents into their own underworlds, would offer hope that transformation is possible even from the most impossible circumstances. She is the goddess of spring and the queen of the dead. She is the maiden in the meadow and the ruler of the shadowed kingdom. She is innocence remembered and wisdom achieved. She is the bridge between worlds, the embodiment of cycles, the eternal proof that transformation is not just possible, but inevitable for those who are willing to grow into what their experiences are calling them to become. And every spring, when the first flowers push through the cold earth, when the trees begin to bud, when the world wakes from its winter sleep, that is Persephone returning. That is the goddess who descended into darkness coming back into the light, bringing with her all the wisdom she gained in the Shadow Kingdom, ready to share her dual nature with a world that needs both her brightness and her depths. She is, in every meaningful sense, both lost and found, both maiden and queen, both daughter and wife, both spring and winter. And in her irreducible complexity, she remains one of the most profound and enduring figures in all of human mythology.